I don't know about you, but when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, state governments really mattered, but not anymore. I reckon if I walked out of this studio tonight and onto the streets of Sydney around nearby, some of the people I encountered, well, they might know the name of the Premier, but the opposition leader and the Treasurer, they'd have no idea. And if I offered $1,000 to name the Premier of every state and the 2 Territory Chief Ministers, I'd be pretty confident the money would stay in my pocket. Some would probably even ask me, what's the point of state governments these days anyway? Well, the current crisis in the building and construction industry over dodgy building standards here in New South Wales and the growing problem of flammable cladding everywhere else, particularly in Victoria, shows the importance of state governments and why, when their level of competence falls away, it matters more to us than any other level of government we interact with. State governments run public schools, public hospitals and most public transport. They're in charge of the police, they still handle planning and they supervise the building of infrastructure, although the actual work is now usually done by private contractors, hence the heavy tolls, and at least some of the funding now comes from the federal government. If the states executed these responsibilities well, as originally intended by the Constitution, which divvies up who does what between the states and the Commonwealth, we mightn't be having so many issues. But the calibre of our state governments, well, it's fallen away over successive decades. People with ability don't tend to want to run for state politics, when if they really wanted to run for reasons of public service, they would. So we get pretty ordinary players ending up running some of our most important portfolios. And when they fail, the real impacts are real. Not that they ever take much responsibility. I mean, when was the last time you heard a state premier say it was all their fault, that they copped it on the chin and committed to cleaning up their own mess without money from the Commonwealth? Most of the time, the first call is to demand a national response or a national strategy, which is all insiders' code to find whatever way they can to get the federal government to pay for what's really a state responsibility to fix. State schools are called state schools precisely because states are supposed to run and fund them. Yet nowadays, about 50% of the funding comes from the federal government, mostly through national partnership agreements, which is why whenever there's a big issue with schools or hospitals, instead of fixing them, the states typically claim that it's all the federal government's fault for not spending enough. This is in addition, I might add, to all the GST, where every single cent is paid to states and territories. It's not like the states ever offer to help the Commonwealth cover the cost of their responsibilities, like pension payments, the nation's welfare bill, Medicare or our national security or defence costs. But we're not passing the buck. When they're not passing the buck, the states are pretty quick to leap on political causes, aren't they? Like state treaties with Aboriginal people or go-it-alone state emissions reduction targets and state renewable energy targets, as if somehow there's some atmospheric curtain that runs along state borders. State Labor governments are also gold medalists at demonising coal while relying on the very same coal royalties to prop up their debt-laden budgets. Take the cladding crisis and the problem with building certification. Once, all of this work was done by state government inspectors. Over the years, the states have contracted their responsibilities out. The rules, yes, they still exist. Indeed, much of the work of the states nowadays is justifying their existence with more and more regulations. Only now, proper enforcement of these rules is left to private contractors, some good and others, well, on the take and out of their technical depth. The bad guys are sending the good guys broke because they've forced up insurance costs. And with the cladding crisis too, even though this is a state responsibility, wait for it, you got it, they want the federal government to fix this as well. As Minister Karen Andrews explained last night on the show, rather than be adult governments and fix it themselves. Likewise, when the next power station closure leads to even higher electricity prices, more blackouts, more rationing, and more industry closures, you won't find any state government accepting responsibility for their failure to build more generation. They'll all point to Canberra and say it's the Fed's fault. What none of these elected MPs seem to understand is while they bicker backwards and forwards about who's got responsibility for what and who's paying the dollars, it's the same taxpayer that picks up the cost, be it state or federal. The buck quite literally stops with us. Now, frankly, I'd love to see the end of state governments, like the UK, where there's just a national government and then local governments delivering the services on the ground. We could streamline so much and save us all billions. The turkeys, well, they don't vote for Christmas, so it's hard to see MPs doing themselves out of a job or the constitutional changes needed getting up. So if we're stuck with them, let's start to really hold them to account. Every time you hear a state politician say that we need a national approach, remember, that's just an MP who's shirking the job you elected them to do.